Illinois Stories is brought to you by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by the support of viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello, welcome to Illinois Stories. I'm Mark McDonald in Quincy at the History Museum of the Quincy Adams County Historical Society, where they are observing the 200th birthday of Stephen A. Douglas. You may not know it, but Stephen A. Douglas moved to Illinois and Quincy at the age of 27, lived here for 7 years, and really started his claim to fame here in Quincy. And in this small room, there is a treasure trove of Douglas memorabilia and facts. Reg Ankrum, you're an author of Stephen A. Douglas, and also you're intimately involved with setting this exhibit up. Douglas was maybe one of the most powerful men in the country by the time 1840s rolled around.
Mm-hmm. Actually, yes. By the mid-19th century, in the 1850s, he was in fact the most powerful politician in the country, including the President of the United States, James Buchanan, whom he beat along with Lincoln in 1858.
At the age of 27, when he moved in, this is an original portrait of him on loan from another Illinoisan named George Buss, who interprets Lincoln.
Yes.
And much of what we're going to see in here is on loan from Buss, who did a wonderful job of supplying you with these things, didn't he?
Right. We're so grateful to George because he lent us a lot of these quality pieces. This is a painting of Stephen Douglas that was done in 1840. And what that tells us is this is what he looked like when he arrived in Quincy, March 3rd of 1841.
During the course of this program, we're going to interview Mr. Douglas. We're also going to go to some of the sites where he lived and worked in Quincy. But before we do that, let's take a look at this house, because after he moved out of an apartment, when he could afford a home, this was his first house in Quincy, wasn't it?
Yes, he came here, lived in the Quincy Hotel for several weeks, and then lived in this home, which is a small Greek Revival home at the intersection of 3rd Street and Jersey here in Quincy. And of course, this picture was taken in the 1930s, but the house was raised in 1955. But Douglas lived there for his official residence for almost 6 years.
Also, above your right shoulder, we have a blow-up, but this is an actual signature.
Right. He was Supreme Court Justice. He had decided a case, and he signed it, the Honorable Stephen A. Douglas, Quincy, Illinois. And that's the title of our exhibit.
It's terrific. This is really wonderful. This is also quality, because this shows everybody knows him from the great debates with Abraham Lincoln, and this would have been about that time, wouldn't it?
Right. There were actually hawkers selling to the partisans in the crowd, a crowd of about 12 to 15,000 people in 1858, pictures of Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln. And the interesting thing was they started selling them at 75 cents a piece. By the time the 3 hours was over, they were going for 15 cents a piece.
We're going to learn during this program how he arranged to become an Illinois Supreme Court Justice, the youngest one, even up to today's date, the youngest Supreme Court Justice. And also how he arranged to get votes to be elected to the Congress. And then once he was in Congress, he pretty much had his way with how his career was going to go.
Right, from the very beginning.
Yeah, he had plans.
Yes, and those who came to him at the very beginning of his congressional career used Douglas, or I should say maybe Douglas used them, to advance that career. It's a great story.
Many people know him not only from the 1858 debates with Abraham Lincoln and the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which actually became the source of the difference between Lincoln and Douglas during the debates. But we learned from this exhibit over here that he actually started working on this issue in the form of a bill way before 1858.
Yeah, in fact, he spent his first day in Congress was December 5th of 1843. And you can see that on the original bill, this is the first Nebraska bill he introduced, and this is a copy of that bill. He introduced that on December 17th. So it wasn't just an impulse of Stephen Douglas that he was interested in bringing Nebraska into the country. He'd actually been working on it for 10 years before the Kansas-Nebraska Act was introduced 10 years later.
10 years later. Now, the Kansas-Nebraska Act was the one that I mentioned. It was a difference between he and Lincoln. He wanted each territory to have their own sovereignty in how they would treat slavery, whether they voted in or vote against it. Isn't that right?
Yes, and the term is popular sovereignty. And in fact, the very first bill he introduced on Nebraska called for the people to vote on whether or not slavery would be introduced. Over time, I'm not sure how quickly it happened, but Douglas did not believe that anyone in their right mind really would vote for a slave state. And what he pointed to were states like Oregon, California, New Mexico, which organized came in and they prohibited in their constitution slavery.
So he was not pro-slavery.
Well, he was neither for or against. I mean, what he was for was expanding the nation. And the unfortunate thing from Stephen Douglas's point of view was that expansion meant in every piece of legislation he worked with, he had to deal with slavery because the South kept asking questions. There's territory in the new Mexican cession, 1/3 of the nation. We have every right to go there. Douglas had to deal with that when you had people like Wilmot from Pennsylvania introducing the proviso that prohibited slavery. And it was Douglas's role to try to somehow coalesce two polar opposites, to bring huge masses of territory into the country.
Let's move this way. See, this bust over here is just terrific. This is, Volk, of course, was a very famous sculptor, and this is an original from 1860.
Right, this was a campaign bust that Leonard Volk did of Douglas, and in a sense, he owed his career to Douglas because Douglas was his patron. Volk studied for a year in Paris, studied art and sculpture, and it was Douglas who paid for that.
And then just to our right, we'll see another, this is an original also from 1860, but it's not very often that you would expect to see copies, but not the original, print,
Right,
or the lithograph.
Yeah, this was Douglas's favorite picture. I'm not sure I would agree with his eye on this, but in any case, this was from a picture that was taken by Matthew Brady, and this picture was actually lithographed by an artist named E. Sainton. And so for some reason, Douglas thought a lot of it. The eyes are most interesting, and that may have been why it was so appealing to Douglas.
Yeah, but it is a Brady, it comes from a Brady photograph, and of
Yes.
course he would have been the most famous photographer at the time. You also have some interesting artifacts down here. And I'm going to get on the other side here. I love this check, this canceled check, because what does this show us, Reg?
Yeah, the most interesting thing, and that is this is the first paycheck that Douglas got as a Supreme Court justice, and you'll notice the date was July of 1841. So he's been here now for 3 months, and his first paycheck is $112, and it was signed by James Shields, who was the auditor, the state auditor at the time. And Shields was the Democrat who challenged Lincoln to a duel. And Lincoln got out of it, as Shields did as well. But so there are connections in history that connect Lincoln and Douglas through James Shields well before 1854 in the Kansas-Nebraska Act.
And over here, now, before he came to Quincy in 1838, he ran for Congress and nearly won, didn't he?
Yes, yeah. He ran against Lincoln's law partner, John Todd Stewart of Springfield. 36,000 votes were cast. Douglas lost by 36. He spent a year crying to Stewart for a recount, and of course, Stewart simply said no.
That's one of the only times anybody said no to Stephen A. Douglas.
Right.
He really had a way of getting his way.
He had a mind for engineering, and a mind that was able to see several political steps in advance. At 23 years old, he started the Democratic Party in Illinois, and then feigned surprise when he gets appointed chairman. And from that point on, he then controls politics in the state of Illinois.
You write about Douglas, and you've become intimately involved with him, so much so that you have a lot of sway with the guy. In fact, you arranged us to get a live interview with Stephen A. Douglas, which we're going to go take an effort at right now.
Good.
Senator Douglas, you were only 27 years old when you arrived in Quincy on March 8th, 1841. And as an Illinois Supreme Court justice. Now I'm told that still makes you the youngest Supreme Court justice in Illinois history. The way you did it is even more interesting, and frankly, it was outlandish.
Outlandish? Well, sir, I don't know how anyone could associate the word outlandish with me. I would prefer you call it astute. Now listen, in the 10 years before 1840, the population of Illinois tripled in size. However, the number of judges on the Supreme Court had stagnated since that court was established. I simply wrote a bill that expanded the number of judges to 9. 9 judges would better serve the people, the overall population, and it would make the court work better as well. So that was my small part in that matter.
And then the legislature appointed you one of the justices.
Well, I wonder how that happened.
Just by chance, I'm sure. Senator Douglas, the makeup of the court went from 3 Whigs and 1 Democrat to 6 Democrats and 3 Whigs, and you were a Democrat.
Well, I don't know if I gave much consideration to that, sir, at that time.
How long were you in Quincy?
My wife and I moved here in 1843. Then the fine people of Quincy honored me by electing me their representative to Congress. I was reelected twice, and after that second election then, the legislature appointed me or elected me to the Senate, representing the great state of Illinois.
Now, in those days, the legislatures elected their state's U.S. senators, right?
Oh, yes, that's correct.
Mm-hmm. And so you resided in Quincy for how long?
I resided in this beautiful town for 7 great years.
Mm-hmm. And where did you live here?
Well, when I first came here, I lived in the Quincy House. Now, that was a beautiful hotel located on 4th and Main. It was built by John Tilson. And that structure now is the old Newcomb Hotel. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Then I moved to a small brick house on the northwest corner of 3rd Street and Jersey.
Now, that would have made you a neighbor of Dr. Richard Eales then.
Well, it did indeed. In fact, I knew the good doctor very well, and of course his lovely wife, Jane.
Mm-hmm. And Quincy, of course, wasn't that big, so it wasn't unusual for you to have known him and his wife. Did you know that the Eales house is known to now have been involved in the Underground Railroad?
Well, did you know, sir, that the first anti-slavery society was established right here in Quincy in 1835?
So you do. History tells us that you tried Dr. Eales in 1842.
I did indeed. And I found Dr. Eales guilty of violating the Illinois Fugitive Slave Act for helping a slave escape from the state of Missouri.
And history tells us Dr. Eales appealed his conviction all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court.
Well, yes, he did. He had every right to do that.
And the courts upheld your ruling.
Of course.
You also protected the Mormon prophet, Joseph Smith.
The Illinois law protected Mr. Smith, sir.
Of course, but Missouri was trying to get Smith back to try him for treason and expected to hang him. You refused the order to send Smith back. Tell us about that.
Well, Missouri Governor Boggs wrote papers of extradition to our governor here in Illinois, Mr. Carlin, who you might know was also from right here in Quincy. Well, I found those papers to be invalid because they had acted on those the year before. So we did not send Mr. Smith back to Missouri.
You had some history with the Mormons, did you not?
Certainly did, but I can proudly say that the entire community of Quincy opened their arms to the saints who came here during that cold winter of 1838, 1839, and they had to do so because the governor of Missouri threatened to kill all of them if they didn't leave that state.
And then you helped them establish the city of Nauvoo.
I am proud to say that as Secretary of State in Illinois, I did sign the charter to make the great city of Nauvoo a new community for them. That is correct, sir.
Senator, we're in the house of John Wood, the founder of Quincy and the 12th governor of Illinois. I'm wondering, did you know John Wood?
Everybody knew John Wood, Mr. McDonald.
Were you close to him?
Well, we both like cigars.
You knew Abraham Lincoln as well, did you not?
I did. I can say I was a good friend of Abraham Lincoln. I knew him a long time. We were out on the stump together for years. Now, we were political opponents. We were political opponents in the debates that took here in Quincy and all throughout the state of Illinois. We were opponents, of course, until the South violated the Constitution by dropping out of our fine Union. Then, that happened even before Mr. Lincoln had even been sworn in. So I told the president-elect, sir, I will assist you. I will help you. I will support you in every measure that you take in order to preserve the Union and restore it to what it had once been. Show me any other Democrat that was willing to do that.
You debated Lincoln here in Quincy in the 6th of the 7 great debates of 1858. They say Lincoln won that debate here.
Well, whatever. Let's leave the historians to decide that. But I tell you, my consolation was I did win that Senate seat.
But you lost the presidency to him in 1860.
Mr. McDonald, it's on record that I said as early as 1856 that a Republican would be in the presidency in 1860. By 1859, I knew that Mr. Lincoln was going to be very, very much in favor, a prominent role in that venture. I knew that. In 1860, the Republicans had no greater man than Abraham Lincoln.
When and why did you move from Quincy to Chicago?
My wife, Martha, and I moved to Chicago in the summer of 1847. Now, as a United States Senator representing this great state of Illinois, I needed to be in a position where I could represent all of the people. I was also abundantly aware that the city of Chicago was going to be the major center for this great state of Illinois. So we moved there, of course.
Thank you, Senator.
My pleasure, Mr. McDonald.
Well, Reg, let's take a little tour of Douglas's Quincy. Mm-hmm. Okay, we're right on Washington Park right now. When he first moved to Quincy in 1841, he was living in an apartment which would have been right there.
Right. It would have been called the Quincy Hotel at that time. It was a very elegant place, and it's now the Newcomb Hotel, the site of the Newcomb Hotel. But when he came to Quincy, he resided in this hotel for several weeks to begin with, and then when he came back to Quincy in 1858, he stayed here overnight, the night of the debate, the night before the debate.
So you say it was an elegant hotel. Would $112 as a Supreme Court judge, could you afford a room in a place like that on $112?
Well, $112, you know, I don't know. I don't know what the cost of the hotel would have been back then.
Yeah,
but he probably could have stayed a few nights, and he had a talent for talking himself into anything, so he probably wouldn't have had to pay anything if he did live there.
Was he married at the time? Did his wife live with him here?
Yeah, he didn't get married until he was in Congress. He was actually in his second term of Congress, so he was single.
Single and a man about town, I'll bet.
Yes, yeah.
And the ladies liked him, didn't they?
And he liked the ladies. Yeah, he was actually engaged to Mary Todd before Lincoln was. So he got along well with the ladies. On the other hand, Mary Todd's sister asked why Mary didn't stay with Douglas instead of Lincoln. And Mary thought Douglas was too profane. He chewed, he spit, he smoked, he drank, and he cussed. That was the reason she said she didn't care for Douglas.
Reg, in our interview with Senator Douglas, we mentioned Dr. Richard Eales and the fact that his house had been used as an Underground Railroad stop to get slaves in from Missouri and disperse them, help them disperse. this is that very house. It's been very well preserved.
Friends of the Eels house.
Yeah, it's terrific. And from what we learned from Senator Douglas about this is he probably very well knew what was going on here.
Yeah, he couldn't have lived here as long as he did without knowing something about Quincy and its tendencies toward anti-slavery. In fact, Quincy was the first anti-slavery society in Illinois, and it wasn't just a small thing. There were 130 members, which was pretty huge at that point. So Douglas did have a trial against Dr. Eels, but Eels was not the only person participating, as Douglas would have well known in Quincy in the anti-slavery movement.
Yeah, and Douglas has this reputation of having been anti-slavery, but we learned from you in the museum that wasn't in fact the case at all. He and a lot of people knew this was going on and chose not to say anything about it.
Yeah, he, from his perspective, Douglas was a great Jacksonian. Jackson believed that the expansion of the nation is the expansion of liberty. Well, Douglas, who took up that mantra and virtually expanded everything west of the Mississippi, knew that he had to have Southern votes to get that done. So he could be neither slavery, pro-slavery, or anti-slavery to get that job done. He kept his counsel close, much as Abraham Lincoln did.
When we were in the museum, we saw that his first house that he lived in, and it was a block and a half that way.
Right.
It's not there anymore, but we can see the site, can't we?
Yes, we can see the site.
Okay, let's do that.
Okay.
Well, Reg, the microtel sits right on the river here now, but in front of that would have been the corner of 3rd and Jersey, and that was his home.
That's where he lived. His official residence was there for about 6 years. He actually lived there just about 2.5 years before he was elected to Congress by the people of Quincy and the surrounding area in 1843.
We saw a photo of that house. The house is gone now. And interestingly, we didn't talk about this in the museum, but that house was called the Brigham House.
Yes. To us who love history here in Quincy, very tantalizing because the fact that Brigham Young was here, and Brigham Young's dad is buried in Quincy, John Young. And if that were true, we know that Douglas had an association with the Mormons. And so it's very interesting to us. We've proven that there was never an owner whose last name was Brigham. And so it gets us closer to our suspicion that Brigham Young could have lived there and recommended to Douglas that he move from the hotel just up the street to this little house.
Yeah. We don't know that Brigham Young lived there, but he may have, and if he did, he may have either sold the house to Douglas, or may have just said, hey, there's a good one available up there.
Yeah, well, just as Brigham didn't own the house, Douglas never owned the house either.
He didn't?
He would have rented it. He lived there, rented it, and kept it as official residence. But the tantalizing thing is, if you look at Nauvoo, many of the homes that have been recreated and restored there look exactly like this one.
I'll be darned.
So it's one more little piece of evidence that's kind of fun. We have no idea, but it's fun to think about.
Well, his last stop, I guess, close to his last stop in Quincy would have been the 1858 debate. That was the 6th of the 7 great debates with Abraham Lincoln. On this site, or very near this site, in Washington Park.
On that day, which was a Wednesday, which followed 16 straight days of rain, the skies broke, it turned out beautiful, and there were about 12 to 15,000 people in this park who listened to two men joust one another for about an hour and a half, or actually an hour and a half apiece for 3 hours.
Debates were so different then than what we experience now. I mean, as I read about them, one man would get an hour, 2 hours, whatever he took. Then the next man would speak for an hour or 2 hours. There wasn't this question and A and this jousting. It was sort of, this is one man's side, this is the other man's side, and they listened very intently to that, didn't they?
Yeah, these were extremely tremendous oratorical debates. They were the old Greek fashion. In fact, Douglas starts off for 90 minutes, then Lincoln delivers his talk in an hour and a half, and Douglas then has 30 more minutes to end his speech. So each of those debates took 3 hours. It was by agreement of both men. And over that time, their partisans would shout. I mean, they were elected by legislators who were supported by partisans in these crowds, so they were actually appealing to the legislators through these crowds.
Yeah, and the central issue, and we talked about this at the museum, was Douglas's Kansas-Nebraska Act, which called for popular sovereignty in deciding slavery, and Lincoln's contention that you can't allow the territories to do that because God knows how big the territories will become, and slavery just could become a mushrooming kind of thing rather than a receding thing.
Yeah, and Lincoln believed that the founders had put slavery on the path of extinction. That's debatable. certainly from Douglas's standpoint. But the fact was, with Kansas, Nebraska, the territories now were open to slavery, to extension, including territory north of the Missouri Compromise line. And the result was Lincoln believed that if that happens one day, we will wake up thinking we had gone to sleep with slavery receding, with now our own states having slavery.
Reg, thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Our thanks also to Gary DeClue for helping us with Senator Douglas. If you want to see the exhibit celebrating the 200th anniversary of the birth of Stephen A. Douglas, you can check it out at the History Museum at the Quincy Adams County Historical Society. It's called the Honorable Stephen A. Douglas in Quincy, Illinois, and it will be there until the end of the year. With another Illinois story in Quincy, I'm Mark McDonald. Thanks for watching.
Illinois Stories is brought to you by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by the support of viewers like you. Thank you. For a DVD copy of the program you've just seen, send $19.95 to Network Knowledge, P.O. Box 6248, Springfield, Illinois 62708. Be sure to include the program name, subject, and when the program aired. You can also order with your credit card by calling 800-232-3605.